Some storms don't just fall from the sky, they live inside us. This is the story of a man the world once knew, a woman the world forgot, and a child too quiet for her age. When a snowstorm trapped them together at the edge of nowhere, something began to thaw, not just in the land, but in their hearts. What began as a search for shelter became something far more powerful, a reminder that money can't heal everything, but presence might. That strangers sometimes see us more clearly than the ones who've known us forever. And that the right hands, at the right time, can hold together what we thought was already lost. But before we begin, where are you watching this story from? Tell us your city or country in the comments, we'd love to know. Now, let's begin. The air was dense with silence, the kind that pressed against the windows and filled every space with a presence of its own. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, blanketing the winding road in a thick white stillness. Visibility had all but vanished. What once was a two-lane road had become a ribbon of uncertainty cutting through the void. Trees stood like frozen sentinels on either side, their outlines blurred by fog and flurries. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under the weight of winter, but the sound didn't travel. It was as if the world had been placed under a glass dome, every noise softened, every movement suspended. Amélia Dunn gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the frayed leather. The heater hummed with effort, barely keeping pace with the cold that crept through the seams of the aging car. Her eyes flicked between the fogged windshield and the dim stretch of road ahead, her breaths shallow, each one clouding the air before her. She had made this drive dozens of times, but never in weather like this. Never with this much weight hanging in her chest. She wasn't running from anything, not exactly. But she wasn't heading toward anything either. The hospital had let her go 3 weeks earlier, funding cuts, they said. A shame, really, given her years of service and spotless record. But budgets didn't care about compassion. Administrators didn't see the nights she'd stayed past her shift or the families she'd sat beside when no one else did. And now, with her days empty and her nights echoing with questions, she had driven to the city for groceries and the brief illusion of purpose. It hadn't helped. As she rounded a bend, the tires skidded slightly on an unseen patch of ice. Her heart jolted, but she steadied the wheel, her foot instinctively easing off the gas. The world beyond the headlights was nothing but a swirl of white and gray. She squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes that formed and dissolved in the storm's breath. Her cabin was still miles away, tucked at the end of a long, unpaved stretch barely worthy of being called a road. And then she saw it. Hazard lights blinked through the curtain of snow, amber pulses in the fog like a heartbeat lost in time. A dark vehicle sat at an odd angle on the shoulder, one tire sunken in what looked like a shallow ditch. Steam curled from beneath the hood, rising upward and vanishing as if swallowed whole by the cold. The shape of a man moved slowly in front of it, not pacing, caring. He emerged from the storm like a shadow stepping into substance, hunched slightly, cradling something close to his chest. Amelia slowed, the car protesting with a crunch of packed snow. She rolled to a stop several yards away, her hands frozen on the wheel. Her first instinct was caution. Her second was training. Even out here, in the middle of nowhere, she could tell something was wrong. The man's movements were deliberate, strained, but not aimless. He was trying to protect someone. And then she saw the child. Motionless. Wrapped in a coat far too big, head tucked beneath the man's chin. Time stretched thin. The storm pressed in, demanding movement or surrender. Amelia's fingers hovered near the door handle. She didn't move immediately. She thought of all the warnings she'd ignored in the past, of the risks she'd taken because someone needed her, of the patients who had come in broken, scared, and silent, and how many times she had chosen to stay beside them even when it wasn't her shift. Even when it wasn't safe. She thought of the ache that had filled her every day since the hospital doors closed behind her. The ache of not being needed. The man didn't knock. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, unmoving, holding the child as the snow collected on his shoulders. The light from her car headlights caught his face for a moment. Not clearly, but enough. Enough to see the exhaustion etched into every line, the silent plea in his posture. He wasn't a threat. He was a father. She opened the door. The cold slapped against her skin the moment it cracked open, stealing warmth from every pore. She stepped out without thinking, boots crunching into the snow, breath catching in her throat. She motioned silently, pointing to the back seat, unsure if her voice would even carry in the storm. He moved immediately, no hesitation, slipping into the warmth of her car with a reverence that bordered on desperation. The child didn't stir. Amelia climbed back in and shut the door. As the car pulled away, the snow quickly swallowed the place where they had been. No tire marks. No trace. Only the storm, endlessly folding in on itself. Neither of them spoke. The hum of the engine, the occasional thud of snow against the windshield, and the faint sound of labored breathing from the child were the only evidence of the world continuing on. Amelia glanced into the rearview mirror. The man sat hunched, his arms still wrapped around the girl, his eyes locked on her face like a lifeline. There was something unspoken in that gaze, not just fear, but a quiet kind of grief. A weariness that came from too many nights without answers. She knew that look. She had worn it herself. The minutes stretched, marked only by the rhythm of the wipers and the dull ache beginning to form behind her eyes. When she turned onto the long, uneven path that led to her cabin, the snow had begun to slow, tapering into a whisper. Trees lined the drive like old bones, silent and watching. The house appeared at the end like a memory, modest, worn, but standing. A single light glowed faintly in the front window, the fire she had left burning before her trip. She parked close to the porch, helped open the door, and watched as the man stepped out with the child still in his arms. No words, no explanations. Just the careful movement of someone who had carried too much for too long. Inside, the warmth of the fire met the cold in their clothes with a sharp hiss. She motioned toward the sofa near the hearth, gathered blankets from the nearby chest, and pulled a kettle onto the stove. Her hands moved with practiced grace, not out of habit, but instinct. The man laid the child down gently, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face with a tenderness that required no narration. Amelia didn't ask questions. Not yet. There would be time for those later, if answers came at all. For now, there was only this. A man, a child, and a woman who still remembered what it meant to care for strangers in the dark. The storm might have lost its voice outside, but inside, something quieter had taken its place. The beginning of something neither of them could name yet. Not hope, not safety, but something just as rare. Something human. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing them inside a space that smelled of cedar smoke and old blankets. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick with things unspoken. The air was warmer here, textured by the crackling fire and the faint hum of the kettle on the stove, but it would take time for their bodies to register it. For now, they were all still wrapped in the chill of what had just passed. Amelia moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had long learned how to suppress panic. She didn't rush. Panic made hands clumsy. It made eyes miss what mattered. Instead, she lit a second oil lamp, one that cast a soft golden halo across the floor, and knelt beside the child who now lay curled under the throw blanket. The girl's skin was too pale. Her breathing too shallow. But it was steady, for now. She checked pulse points without asking permission, lifted the child's wrist like she'd done thousands of times before, and tucked 2 fingers beneath her jaw. The girl stirred faintly, brows furrowing, but didn't wake. There were no bruises. No obvious wounds. Just a frail, fever-warmed body trying to hold on. Behind her, the man stood still as stone, his back to the fire, his clothes soaked and clinging to him in dark folds. He didn't remove his coat. He didn't sit. He only watched, not Amelia, but the girl. As if blinking might make her vanish. The kettle began to whistle. Amelia stood without a word, poured hot water into a chipped ceramic bowl, and gathered herbs from a tin beside the sink. She had never been the holistic type. Not until the hospital let her go and she was left to rely on the quiet rituals her grandmother had once taught her, rituals made of steam, warmth, and time. She placed the bowl on the table, dipped a clean cloth, and returned to the girl. Carefully, rhythmically, she wiped her forehead, coaxing the heat to retreat. The man finally moved. He sank into the armchair across from them, his posture still tense but fraying at the edges. The firelight touched the planes of his face now, revealing something both familiar and distant. The kind of face the world often recognized before it understood. There was an intensity there, but not the dangerous kind. It was the intensity of someone who had not slept in days, maybe longer. Someone who had crossed lines not visible on maps. Amelia didn't ask his name. She didn't need it yet. Names came with stories, and stories had to be earned. Instead, she focused on the girl. A few sips of warm broth. A fresh layer of dry clothes. A clean blanket from the chest in the hallway, not her favorite, not yet, but soft enough. She worked in near silence, speaking only with her movements, and the room responded in kind. The fire danced shadows along the wood-paneled walls. The wind outside had faded to a dull hiss, as if the storm, too, was resting. Hours passed in fragments. The girl stirred once, murmured something unintelligible, and nestled deeper into the blanket. Her breathing improved. Color returned to her cheeks in fragile bursts. Amelia remained nearby, perched on the edge of the hearth, hands loosely clasped in her lap. The man hadn't moved much. Once, he leaned forward to rest his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook once, whether from cold or something else, Amelia couldn't tell. She didn't pry. People unraveled on their own time. The only thing she could offer was a place for it to happen. Eventually, the girl slept soundly. Amelia stood, rolled her shoulders to ease the stiffness, and moved to the small kitchen to clean the bowl and cloth. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the armchair. When she turned, the man had finally removed his coat and draped it across the backrest. He looked younger now, or perhaps just more real. Less like a figure and more like a person. The kind of person who once belonged to the world, and perhaps still did. He followed her silently as she prepared a second round of tea, this time with a pinch of mint and a touch of honey. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of the other armchair. Without needing an invitation, he sat. They drank in silence, each sip marking a small thaw. Not just in their bodies, but in the space between them. He glanced toward the sleeping child often. Each time he did, something in his expression shifted, softening in places where before there had only been restraint. Amelia noticed the way his eyes lingered on the child's face. The way his hand twitched every time she stirred. The way he seemed to be waiting for something, permission maybe, or peace. He hadn't come here by chance. She knew that now. He had chosen this road, chosen isolation, chosen distance. But she didn't ask. Instead, she handed him a wool blanket and pointed to the couch near the fire. He accepted it with a nod and laid down carefully, his gaze never leaving the flickering shadows on the ceiling. Amelia dimmed the lamp and moved to her own room, but she didn't close the door. Sleep came slowly. That night, the storm outside finally stopped. Inside, a different storm was still unraveling, quiet, cautious, and without lightning. The kind made of memory and grief and the fragile possibility of beginning again. And in that house at the end of the road, where no one had knocked for years, where silence had made its home, 2 strangers and a sleeping child shared something wordless. Not safety, not trust, not yet, but something in between. Morning arrived without announcement. No sunlight pierced the thick clouds, no birds called through the trees. Only the quiet remained, blanketing the cabin like fresh snow. The storm had moved on, but its weight lingered. Cold still clung to the windows, and the fire had become a cradle of embers, glowing faintly, as if recovering from its own long night. Amelia rose early, her body already accustomed to waking before necessity. Habit, perhaps? Or simply the residue of years spent answering to the cries of others. She moved quietly, her feet wrapped in wool, her breath visible as she stepped into the living room. He was still there, blanket askew across his shoulders, one arm resting protectively over the edge of the couch, where the child had fallen asleep sometime after midnight. Elise, that was the name embroidered faintly on the inside of the girl's collar, barely visible, but enough. The girl hadn't stirred since the night before, but her breathing had deepened. She looked more alive. Less like a secret being carried and more like a child finally at rest. Amelia took this as a silent invitation to do what she did best. Care, without question. She rekindled the fire, boiled water for tea, and gathered oats and dried fruit for a simple breakfast. The cabin filled slowly with the scent of cinnamon and warmth. Life returned to the walls in increments. The smell of something cooking, the rhythm of measured footsteps, the soft clatter of a spoon against ceramic. The man stirred eventually, blinking against the dawn that hadn't quite arrived. His first motion was toward Elise, and only when he saw her breathing steady and calm did his shoulders release their tension. He sat at the table without a word, accepting a mug of tea with both hands, holding it not to drink, but as if its heat might thaw something internal. Amelia didn't speak either. The silence wasn't awkward, it was practical. Words would come later or not at all. That too was familiar. But something shifted as the morning stretched on. He began to help, unasked, without hesitation. Gathering kindling from the back porch, refilling the water pot, chopping root vegetables for soup with an efficiency that surprised her. He moved like someone used to doing things quickly, silently, as if trying not to be seen. As if being noticed always came with a cost. The child slept late. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open with confusion. For a brief second, she looked toward Amelia, then her father, and said nothing. Her fingers reached for his sleeve, her face buried into his arm. He held her close, breathing in her presence like a man who'd nearly forgotten what safety smelled like. They stayed like that for a long time. Later, Amelia helped the girl wash up, coaxed her into eating a few spoonfuls of soup, and listened as the child whispered responses to simple questions. No fever. No nausea. But her voice was thin, as though every word had to be borrowed. Her father hovered nearby but didn't interrupt. He watched the way Amelia handled his daughter, not with pity or performance, but with patience. And that seemed to shake something loose in him. He began to linger in the same room instead of drifting into corners. He asked small things, where the towels were, if the generator might hold a bit longer, whether the snow would trap them another day. His voice, when he used it, was deeper than she'd imagined. Tired, and yet careful. Every sentence he spoke felt like it had been edited a dozen times in his mind before it passed his lips. And then, the slip. He left his coat over the kitchen chair, and when Amelia moved it to keep it from catching a splatter of broth, a slim leather wallet fell to the floor. She caught it midair. Reflex. She didn't mean to look, but the name engraved in gold caught her attention anyway. Richard Hale. She froze. Not because the name meant something to her personally, but because it was a name everyone had heard. Headlines. Interviews. Magazine covers. The pharmaceutical empire. The publicized death of his wife. The rumors about his daughter's illness. The scandal that followed when he withdrew from every board, every camera, every public appearance. The name had vanished from the press months ago, replaced by silence. Until now. She didn't say anything. She placed the wallet back where it had fallen, face down, and returned to stirring the pot as if nothing had changed. But everything had. A puzzle had begun to take shape, and with it, a truth she hadn't expected. He hadn't come here to hide from danger. He had come to hide from the weight of being known. That night, after Elise fell asleep again curled into the blanket she refused to share, Richard sat at the hearth without a book or a distraction. Just the fire. Just the hush of snowfall beyond the walls. And then, as if testing the strength of invisible glass, he spoke. Not of the company. Not of the headlines. Not even of the death that had followed him like a second shadow. He spoke of the road. Of the miles he had driven without sleep. Of the hospitals that had failed to provide answers. Of the advisors who had suggested boarding schools and private nurses instead of healing. Of how his daughter no longer smiled. Of how he no longer knew what made her laugh. He spoke in half-finished sentences of money that bought everything except the only thing that mattered. Amelia didn't interrupt. She listened the way she'd learned to in quiet hospital rooms, listening not for facts, but for the parts people didn't know they were revealing. She let him speak until he stopped. Until there was nothing left but firelight between them. When the silence returned, it was different. No longer a shield. Now it was a mirror. She rose, handed him the same blanket he'd used the night before, and this time, he didn't return to the couch. He sat on the floor, beside his daughter, watching the rise and fall of her breath as if it were the only thing holding him together. That night, Amelia stood at her bedroom door, hand on the frame, and understood something simple and profound. He had never meant to stay. But now, he didn't know how to leave. And for the first time in years, neither did she. The following days unfolded like pages in a book no one had planned to write. Outside, the world remained paused. The snow thickened its hold over the landscape, muffling the outlines of trees and paths and possibilities. But inside the cabin, a quiet rhythm began to take shape. One that was not dictated by time or obligation, but by need. And that rhythm, though fragile, began to hum with something steady. Elise regained some of her strength. Not all at once. It came in increments, a longer nap, a cleaner breath, a glance that lingered a little longer on Amelia's face. She still didn't say much. But she smiled, faintly, when handed a cup of warm tea sweetened with a touch of honey. She leaned into her father more easily, not out of fear, but familiarity. The tension in her shoulders began to fade. The child who had arrived like a ghost began to look like a girl again. And Richard, he changed too. He no longer moved with the stiffness of someone guarding secrets. Instead, he began to linger. He chopped wood without being asked, cleaned the muddy floor near the back door, repaired a broken cabinet hinge with tools Amelia had long abandoned. He didn't talk much about his past. That part of him still remained locked behind his quiet, but in his gestures, something softened. Something unlearned began to return. But it didn't last. Late one evening, when the wind had grown bold again and Elise had fallen into a deep sleep on the couch, it returned, the fever. Amelia was the first to notice. She touched the girl's forehead out of habit, expecting to find the soft warmth of a child tucked into comfort. But instead, she felt the fire climbing beneath her skin, pulsing too fast. Her breaths were shallow again. Her hands cold despite the blankets. She moved quickly. Wet towels, ginger root tea, a cooled cloth against the neck. She set a bowl near the bed, opened the window slightly to let the air cut through the rising heat, and whispered stories into Elise's ear that she couldn't remember preparing. But her eyes flicked toward Richard. He had frozen, standing beside the hearth, unmoving, not blinking, not breathing. And then came the crack. Not of a branch or a floorboard, but of something internal. Something that had held too tightly for too long. He began pacing, pulled out his phone, no service, checked his watch, then his jacket, as if keys to some other world might still be there. He searched for a signal at the front door, at the edge of the porch. His voice, quiet until now, cracked open in a stream of half-sentences and panicked logic. He spoke names of specialists, clinics, jets that could be summoned. None of them reachable. None of them here. Amelia called to him gently, not with words, but with presence. She placed a hand on Elise's chest, signaling what mattered. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "I've done everything." His silence seemed to scream. "Why isn't it enough?" And it wasn't. Not because he hadn't tried, but because the answer didn't lie in wealth or plans or power. It lay in stillness. In staying. She motioned for him to sit. For a moment he resisted. Then he lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, his hand trembling as it reached for his daughter's. His fingers grazed hers, hesitant, like someone uncertain if they were allowed. Elise stirred faintly at the touch, her face relaxing. That was all it took. He wept. Not loudly, not in collapse, but in the quiet, gasping way men do when they've never been taught how. His shoulders curled inward. His hand remained on hers. And beside him, Amelia knelt with the cloth in one hand and her breath caught in her chest, not because he was crying, but because she had seen this before. Not from him. From mothers who had waited too long for news. From patients who knew they were out of time. From herself, on nights she couldn't explain why she still kept an extra pillow on the couch after her father died. Grief wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just the way someone held their breath too long. She let him cry. She sat with him through the night, both of them watching the rise and fall of Elise's chest like it was the only clock that mattered. Time passed, but not as hours. As prayers. By morning, the fever had broken again. Elise's forehead was damp but cooler. Her eyes fluttered open, not wide, not alert, but aware. And when they landed on her father, something passed between them. Something even Amelia didn't try to name. Later, Richard helped prepare breakfast. He didn't speak. But he didn't need to. Every motion said what his mouth couldn't. I thought I could fix it all. I thought if I did enough, gave enough, paid enough, I could keep her safe. He hadn't been running from danger. He had been running from the moment when he might be told that even his best wasn't enough. And here, in a forgotten cabin on a road no one traveled, he'd been forced to sit inside that fear and live through it. That afternoon, as Elise napped again, Richard stepped outside to clear snow from the path. Amelia watched from the window as he moved the shovel with slow, deliberate care. Not like a man who had done it before, but like someone who needed to. Like someone making space for something new. Inside, Amelia cleaned the kitchen, folded blankets, and tucked a note into her journal she hadn't touched in weeks. He didn't need a nurse. He needed permission to be human. The storm had broken more than clouds. It had broken the illusion that love could be purchased or peace commanded. And in the aftermath, Richard Hale, the man the world knew, the man who'd vanished, began to return not to power, but to presence. And it started with sitting still beside his sick child and asking nothing but time. The days that followed moved more gently, as if the storm had not only cleared the sky but softened time itself. There was no urgency now, only repetition. Firewood stacked by the door. Soup reheated. Warm water checked with the back of a hand before touching Elise's skin. No grand gestures. No sudden revelations. Just presence. And sometimes, that was the most radical kind of healing. Richard no longer hovered over his daughter with silent panic. He sat beside her and read stories with a voice that stumbled over the words, not from confusion, but from disuse. He learned the rhythm of Amelia's routines, how she brewed the tea, how she hummed while folding towels, how she didn't ask unnecessary questions but somehow always knew what needed to be done. He had lived most of his life surrounded by answers. Experts, consultants, assistants who scheduled his meals and delivered perfectly folded suits to rooms he didn't recognize. But here, nothing was curated. There were mismatched chairs, a squeaky drawer in the kitchen, and a quilt on the bed that had lost half its color. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to leave. Amelia noticed the change, though she said nothing. She had long ago learned to trust what was not spoken. The way his shoulders no longer curled inward when Elise coughed, the way his hands moved without tension as he repaired the door latch, the way he lingered in her silence without trying to fill it. The snow began to melt. Just a little. Patches of brown broke through the white at the base of the trees. The road that had disappeared days before began to reappear in pieces, like memory returning in flashes. With it came the inevitable truth. Soon he would leave. But he didn't mention it. Not even when the radio, briefly reconnected, buzzed with news of the weather clearing. Not even when the generator blinked twice and roared back to life. He made no plans. Packed no bags. Instead, one morning he placed a folder on the table. A plain folder, no logo, no signature. Inside, Amelia found documents, a proposal, handwritten notes, medical outlines. She didn't understand all the terms, but she understood what it meant. A foundation, not a hospital, not a charity. Something between the two. A quiet place for children like Elise, in towns like this. It would start here, with a small converted property not far from the cabin. He had already secured it. The paperwork was signed. All it needed now was someone to lead it. Someone who had proven that presence was more powerful than protocol. He didn't pitch it. He didn't ask. He simply left the folder on the table and stepped outside to chop wood. Amelia sat for a long time with the folder in her lap, her tea growing cold beside her. Her name wasn't on the documents, but she felt herself inside every page. Every line echoed something she had said in passing or done without thinking. It wasn't a gift. It was an offering, one made with humility. That evening, after Elise had fallen asleep and the fire crackled with low light, Amelia found him on the porch. He didn't turn when she approached, only shifted slightly to make space beside him. They stood there in silence, the cold brushing against their coats, the stars returning to a sky that had forgotten them for days. She didn't need to say yes. Not out loud. But she handed him the folder, closed again, her fingers resting lightly on the cover. That was enough. He looked at her, and for the first time, didn't look away. The road that had once been a white void was now a path again, damp, rutted, and real. The cabin, once buried beneath layers of silence and storm, stood revealed in the late morning light. Its roof glistened with melted snow. The smoke from its chimney rose in a gentle curl, steady and sure. The world had reopened. But none Dealys wanted to leave. Not out of fear. Not anymore. But because something had settled between those wooden walls. Something not built by force or need, but by repetition, by trust formed in the pause between illness and recovery, by the stillness shared in long nights and unspoken understanding. Yet leaving wasn't abandonment. It was continuation. And so, on a morning touched by birdsong and the faint warmth of late winter sun, Richard packed the car. Not hurriedly. Not with that rigid tension he had carried when he first arrived. He packed the way someone packs for a return they no longer dread. Elise wore the same knit hat Amelia had mended for her 3 nights prior. She stood by the porch, hugging a faded stuffed animal found at the back of the linen closet. She didn't cry. But she didn't smile either. Her eyes stayed on Amelia as if trying to memorize something too large for a child to name. Amelia crouched beside her, smoothing a strand of hair behind her ear, adjusting the scarf. No parting words. Children didn't need speeches. Just presence. Elise reached forward, wordless, and wrapped her arms around Amelia's neck. That was enough. Richard stood a few steps away, watching. The distance wasn't avoidance, it was reverence. When Amelia stood, their eyes met. He didn't thank her. Not with words. Instead, he simply nodded, not goodbye, not farewell. Just acknowledgement. Recognition of what had passed between them. Of what might still return. They left slowly. No tire tracks remained after they turned the bend. The cabin stood quiet again, but not hollow. Not forgotten. It had become something else, a marker. A place where something broken had been made still enough to begin healing. Weeks passed. Snow gave way to thaw. The stream near the tree line flowed freely again, dragging twigs and last year's leaves downstream like offerings to spring. Amelia resumed her routines, but something was different. Her movements were not heavier, but more deliberate. She brewed stronger tea. She hummed unfamiliar lullabies. She opened the windows earlier in the day, even when the air was still cold. And every now and then, she found herself pausing at the table where the folder had once rested, her fingers grazing the wood as if waiting for its weight again. Then, the letter came. Hand-delivered. No return address. Inside, a single page. A name, the Elise Foundation. Below it, a job title, Director of Pediatric Outreach. A date, a time, an address. She smiled. Not because she was surprised, but because she wasn't. When she arrived at the converted farmhouse now dressed in sunlight and fresh paint, she found a place that looked nothing like a hospital and everything like a beginning. Warm walls. Open rooms. Shelves lined with books and art supplies. The scent of bread. The soft murmur of voices not silenced, but respected. At the entrance, a small plaque. For the moments we almost gave up, and the hands that kept us from falling. Richard stood near the front desk, dressed simply, no guards, no entourage. He saw her the moment she walked in, and smiled. Not the smile of a man trying to impress, but the quiet recognition of someone who had waited for this exact moment. From that day forward, they worked side by side. Not as saviors. Not as figureheads. But as people who had once come apart and decided to rebuild, differently. Gently. With patience. The weeks turned into months. The center grew. Children came and went. Laughter returned to halls that had once held only echoes. Amelia learned how to manage a team, how to navigate donors, how to present reports with the same calm she once used to steady trembling hands. And Richard, he learned how to stay. He showed up each morning. Pushed swings. Folded blankets. Waited outside exam rooms holding a cup of tea for whoever needed it next. He was no longer the man the world whispered about. He was the man who always remembered the names of the mothers, who fixed a leaky sink without being asked, who sat quietly during difficult diagnoses and never once checked his phone. Elise grew stronger. She began speaking in full sentences, began drawing, began laughing at unexpected moments, sharp bursts of joy that cut through long afternoons. She no longer reached for her father in panic, but in play. And sometimes she reached for Amelia too. One evening, after the last staff had gone and the sky had turned the color of soft rust, the three of them stood at the back porch of the foundation, watching the light change. Amelia leaned on the railing, sipping her tea. Richard stood beside her, his hand resting lightly near hers. Elise chased a paper kite across the grass, giggling as it dipped and rose in the breeze. No declarations were made. No confessions offered. Just a glance, from him to her, and something spoken in silence. This could be home. And she nodded. Not as permission, as agreement. Later, as the lights dimmed and the building settled into rest, a new plaque was placed in the garden. The house at the end of the road. Not because it was where everything ended, but because it was where something, quiet and broken and buried, had found its way back to life. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched something inside you, a memory, a longing, or simply reminded you that healing can start quietly, consider subscribing. We share stories like this to remind each other of what still matters. And now we'd love to hear from you. What moment in this story stayed with you the longest? Was it the snowstorm? The silence? The way someone finally chose to stay? Scroll down and share your thoughts in the comments. We read every word. See you in the next one.